Hello, this is Maria Williams. Today I'm using one of Altenew's mini delights. It's a very small stamp and die set that I think is really versatile. I know sometimes we have a full stamp and die set and we get a little overwhelmed, but I find these mini delights really easy to work with. And so today I am showing you 4 cards that I made with it. My first card is going to be the simplest one, and I'm using these Summer Sherbet crisp die inks from Altenew. The great thing about using a set is that you know that all those colors are going to coordinate really well with each other. So I'm stamping the balloon 5 times, so I'm using all the colors except for the bamboo, which is the darker green. This is going to be a 1-layer card except for the sentiment, which is going to be popped up. So I want to make sure that I know exactly where the fold of my card is. So I'm just putting a piece of post-it tape there. So it doesn't matter that it doesn't go all the way down the bottom of the card. I'm starting out by mounting my solid stamp onto an acrylic block, and then I'm going to arrange my colors in the order that I'm going to stamp them, which is actually rainbow order because I am considering the cotton candy my violet. I've already decided where my sentiment is going to go, so I've placed the stamp on the card as a reference, and then I'm just going to start at the bottom to make sure that the sentiment and the lower balloon are looking good. So I'm starting out with the cotton candy and just stamping the first balloon. And then instead of going one at a time straight up, I'm going to stamp the one at the top of the card. The balloon at the top is stamped with pink pearl ink, and then I'm going to stamp the one in the middle, which is getting stamped in citrus burst. So this way I've got my spacing just the way I want it, and then it's easy to just nestle the other two in between. The green ink I'm using is called Limeade, and the orange one is called Sunkissed. In between each one of the colors, I am making sure that I clean my stamp really well. I'm using my chamois that I used all the time, and just making sure that after I wipe it with a chamois, it's also nice and dry so that it doesn't dilute my ink at all, because this would cause it to kind of feather and smudge, and my image wouldn't be crisp. Next, I'm going to work on my sentiment. So I'm taking a piece of black cardstock, this is Lawn Fawn Black Licorice, and treating it with my anti-static pouch. And then I'm taking the sentiment, which by the way I had to hunt for because it got stuck to the plastic of the cardstock package, but I found it and set it up nice and straight on a block, and then I'm just using some Versamark ink, stamping it onto the black cardstock, putting on some white embossing powder. This is Stampendous. I've had it for quite a while and it's pretty good. So I'm just sprinkling that all over, making sure I close my container, and then I'm getting my heat tool really nice and hot and melting the powder. Then I just use my tonic mini trimmer and trim it down, leaving just a tiny little bit of space all around, and then it's ready to put it on my card. For the balloon strings, I'm simply taking a black pen and drawing the lines in with a ruler. And the pen I'm using is a Micron 0.03, which I think is a good width, but the problem with this pen is that it kind of left puddles at the beginning, every time I started to write. So I am going to be looking for an alternative. Sorry about my crazy hair making several appearances. I did try to edit it out, but there was no way without just cutting out the whole section of video. So I also did some little bows at the bottom of the balloons just to add a little bit more detail, and then that was done. To add a little more color to the card, I decided to make a little bit of a rainbow on the edge, and I had already tried it on this scrap piece of paper, but the green got a little bit muddled, and so I decided to do it on the edge of the card, and that got even worse. So this is my third attempt, and so I'm going to be extremely careful to clean off my my glass mat in between every color and to make sure that there's no ink that's going to cause me a problem. Also, in between the colors, I wanted to have a little bit of definition. So I am taking small pieces of post-it tape and just putting them kind of loosely, just kind of on the edge of the color that I've already done, and then taking the next color and blending it onto the side of the cardstock. I really didn't measure anything for this, and I didn't even use my glass mat as a guide, you know, the grid on my glass mat. I just simply put the color on right in the middle in a section that I thought was about 1/5, and then just kind of went from there. Once I was done blending all the colors, I trimmed off about 1/2 inch from the right side of the front of the card, and I also cut about just a little bit over 1/2 inch wide strip from the ink blended piece of cardstock and glued that to the inside of the card. I think this adds a lot to the card design, and it is super simple to do. And the only reason why I had trouble with it was, first of all, because I did not clean my glass countertop. And then the second time that I tried to do it directly onto the card base, I had washed the blending brush and it wasn't dry enough. And so I ended up tearing up my paper. So the last thing that I need to do now is just put my sentiment onto the card, and I'm using this 1/4 inch tape from scrapbook.com, foam tape. I love it. I've never had tape that was this width before, and it is perfect for these thin sentiments. So I'm just taking some of that, putting it onto the back of my sentiment, and then just attaching it so it's right up against the cut edge. I somehow lost the footage where I add a couple of balloons to the inside of the card, but at the end of the video I will have a flip through and you can see how I added those. For my next card, I'm keeping my color palette to just 3 colors, black, white, and gold. So I'm going to use 2 different shades of gold mirror card from this Festive Lights pack from Tonic Studios. And I am just doing regular embossing on the 2 different gold cardstocks. So I'm treating the cardstock with my anti-static pouch. And then I have already set up my stamp and my MISTI. I've made 2 pieces of cardstock that are large enough to just fit 2 of the hearts. So I'm putting my piece of cardstock into the corner of the MISTI, inking the stamp up with my Versamark ink and stamping it. And then I'm taking out the piece of cardstock, rotating it, and stamping one more time. I think a lot of people don't know that you can stamp on mirror cardstock, but as you'll see here, you can. But you do have to be a little bit careful and do a sample before you make your final decisions for your card. Because what I found out when I was heat embossing both these cardstocks is that the satin cardstock, which is the honey gold, did not change colors at all. But when I heat embossed the harvest gold, which is the glossy one, it kind of lost the gold sheen to it. It kind of turned into more of a holographic type of cardstock, which is really not what I was looking for. So as you'll see, I did end up going to a different type of cardstock. I wanted to point out that in my Mini MISTI, I still have the Sizzix double-sided repositionable adhesive sheet, so I don't have to use any kind of magnet or tape or anything to hold these pieces down. So here is where I am heat setting the embossing powder onto the mirror cardstock, and as you can see, the satin gold, which is the honey gold, looks perfectly fine, but I don't know if you can see how the color is changing on this brighter cardstock. I figured I would still use it, so I went ahead and die cut all the shapes with the matching die, and then I got ready to work on my card base. I have a piece of 110-pound Nina Solar White cardstock that is 4¼ by 11 inches. So my card will end up being a standard A2 size card, and it's scored at 5.5. And what I'm doing is trimming 1/2 inch off the left side of the front panel, and then from that point I'm measuring another 2¼ inches and cutting that. And then I'm just going to take some scissors and trim off those two pieces. So this gives me a strip down the front of the card that is attached to the back that is 2¼ inches wide. Then I'm going to take some pattern paper and I'm going to cut a piece to 2¼ inches by 5½ so that matches the strip down the front of the card, and I'm going to glue it with some Nouveau Deluxe adhesive. I die cut a 3½ inch circle from Lawn Fawn Black Licorice cardstock. I really like it because it's nice and sturdy. And I'm going to start laying out my elements. And originally my plan was to stamp the sentiment on the inside of the card along the side of that front flap. But I felt like if you had the card set up you wouldn't be able to see it, so I decided to just put it onto the circle. And as I was laying out the elements, this is when I decided I just didn't really like that gold. And I went ahead and picked out some other cardstock, and I'm sorry, I don't know what brand it is, where it came from. I'm thinking it probably just came from Hobby Lobby or Michael's, but it's a much brighter, shinier cardstock. And I went ahead and stamped and heat embossed the balloon onto it, and I also did the sentiment. I trimmed the sentiment out with my Tonic Mini Guillotine trimmer, and then I grabbed my Signal Uniball gel pen, and I went ahead and drew the strings for the balloons in. And I could have mounted the balloons on first and then drawn the strings, but I didn't want the balloon to actually interfere with the string. I wanted the string to actually go under the balloon. So I kind of placed them on my piece of black cardstock and drew the strings first, and then mounted them later with some foam tape. And I wanted to add a little bit of detail to the balloon, so I just took the gel pen and drew on to the mirror cardstock. And it does take a minute to dry, but it doesn't take long at all. You don't have to heat set it or anything, and it will be permanent. To assemble the card, I just used some glue to attach the black circle onto the front flap of the card. And then I pulled out some black foam squares from my stash. I thought these would be perfect since I'm gluing the balloons onto black cardstock. And then I used that same 1/4 inch foam tape from scrapbook.com that I used for the first card to glue down the sentiment onto the lower part of the circle. I love the way this card turned out, and I'm really glad that I switched over to the shinier gold. I think this is actually my favorite card out of the 4. For my next card, I wanted to create a cluster of balloons on the front of the card, so I am cutting out a mask from some Gina K masking paper. I'm just stamping the balloon outline with some Memento ink and cutting it out with my scissors. And then I'm going to go ahead and prep my cardstock and ink the stamp up with the Versamark ink and stamp, and then apply the gold embossing powder. I'm using Ranger Superfine embossing powder and heat setting that. And then I can place my mask over that balloon and stamp the next two on either side of it. So when I did this first go around with the mask, I removed the mask before I applied the embossing powder. And even though the masking paper has very little sticky on it, it did leave enough residue behind that the embossing powder stuck to the first balloon that I had stamped. So for the subsequent stampings with the mask, I will leave the mask on when I put the embossing powder on. To remove the embossing powder that made it onto that first balloon, I just took a small soft paintbrush and brushed all that embossing powder away. And you can't see any of it after I heat embossed. When I was ready to stamp the last balloon, I really needed 2 masks, but I was being a little bit lazy, so I just kind of eyeballed the curve of the balloon on the left, and I just cut out a small strip of paper. This was just my typing paper that I was using to catch my embossing powder, and just placed it over that balloon, and then stamped. And as you can see, I left the mask on the balloon that's on top of the one that I just stamped when I applied the embossing powder. And it looked like I had a little bit of a problem in that one area. So I just took a embossing marker. I haven't seen these around recently. I'll try to find one and add it to my supply list on my blog post. But I went ahead and drew that line of the balloon again and put some more embossing powder on it, and then just kind of used the paintbrush to make it look as best I could. And then I went ahead and he set that balloon. And I don't think anybody will notice that it's not perfect once it's colored in. To color the balloons, I'm using this Gansai Tombi Starry Colors watercolor set. They're all different shades of gold, and they're really sparkly in real life. So the first thing I'm doing is adding some water to the ones that I think I want to use on my project. I actually swatched out 4 of them, and this is a good thing to do because since you can see the color of the cardstock through the watercolor a little bit, your colors of watercolor will look a little bit different depending on the cardstock. So I just wanted to make sure that I liked how these shades were going to look on my cardstock. So I picked out 3 of the colors, and I'm going to start painting. I have a piece of paper towel in my hand in case I need to blot away any excess water, but I'm really trying to use as little water as I can get away with and still be able to spread out the color, because I'm not using watercolor cardstock. This is, I believe this is Lawn Fawn Blue Jay cardstock. I'm sorry, Blue Jay cardstock from Lawn Fawn. And so yeah, so I'm just trying to use very little water, and using that paper towel to dry off my brush after I rinse it off from using each one of the colors. I'm going to trim the front panel of my card with a stitched rectangle die. So I'm just placing it over the panel and drawing the balloon strings in. And then I'm going to figure out the placement of my sentiment. So everything was smooth sailing, everything was going great, and I decided that I would like a little bit more gold on the panel, and decided to do some splatter with the watercolors, and it all went terribly wrong. It just looked like a big mess, and so rather than just trashing the whole thing, I decided to just use my scissors, cut close to the edge so that I could eliminate that haze that I had created around the balloons, and then mount them onto a separate card. So I die cut another piece of the Blue Jay cardstock with my stitched rectangle die, put lots and lots of foam tape behind the watercolored balloons because the water had, kind of makes it warp a little bit. So I just put lots of foam tape and just adhered it to the stitched rectangle. Once again, I grabbed my gold metallic Signo Broad Uniball pen, it's a very long name, and drew in the strings for the balloons. To add a little bit more gold to the front of my card, I have cut a piece of mirror cardstock, that Harvest Gold, to be a little bit bigger than my front panel, and I'm just going to attach those two together with some heavy-duty double-sided tape. Because my mirror card for some reason is warped. My whole pack came that way. And then I am going to attach that onto the card base. My card base is made out of 110-pound Nina Solar White cardstock, and I already have some Blue Jay cardstock attached to it. This is actually the piece of Blue Jay cardstock that I die cut the stitch rectangle from, and that is cut to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, so it gives me a little bit of a white border. And then I'm attaching the sentiment once again with some of that 1/4 inch double-sided foam tape. And I didn't show you how I heat embossed that sentiment, but basically the same way that I've done the rest of the heat embossing, and it's just that super fine Ranger gold embossing powder onto white cardstock. I kept wondering why the card looked a little bit off center to me, the balloon strings, and I realized it was because I was actually missing one. So if you were really observant, you probably noticed it earlier in the video, but I didn't notice up until this point. So anyway, last but not least, I added some Nuvo drops, and after the splatter fiasco, I was a little worried about adding the drops directly to my card. So what I did is I made some dots onto a silicone mat in all different sizes, and then I can kind of test them out. And I settled on 3 on either side of the balloons. So I'm just going to use some Nuvo adhesive to glue those down. A little bit of my glue did squirt out the sides, but here's a close-up, and you really can't see it. I really can't say enough good things about this Nuvo Deluxe adhesive. And that is card number 3. The design for my last card is very similar to the first one, except that I'm going to make a shaker card. And I want to stamp the balloons on the inside of the shaker. So I've cut 2 cardstock panels, a little bit smaller than a standard size card. So they are 3 3/4 inches wide by 5.5 inches tall. So I'm going to have a 1/4 inch on either side of the panel. And then I'm cutting some strips of purple tape because I want to create a striped background on the front of my card. It's really easy to create the strips. All I have to do is stick the tape onto my glass mat and then just use a straight edge and an X-Acto knife to cut the strips. The tape cuts really easily, and if you're not, if you're kind of careful when you're cutting, it doesn't do any damage to your glass mat at all. I decided I wanted my sentiment to go on one of the white stripes, so I am placing tape where I want my sentiment to go and making sure that my strip is wide enough for my sentiment to fit. And then I'm just kind of randomly placing the rest of the strips. I am trying to alternate the width of the spaces that I'm leaving as well as the width of the strips that I'm putting down. So I definitely don't want this to be symmetrical at all. I wanted to use a combination of blues and greens for this card, so I decided to use mostly the Stamp Market inks because that's where I have a better selection of those colors. And so I'm using sea glass for the background. I could have used Distress Oxide ink, which is what I like to ink blend with the best, but I wanted to use whatever I use for my background for one of the balloons as well. So I'm just using the sea glass ink from the Stamp Market. The cardstock, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, is Bristol Smooth White cardstock, and I'm using it because it has such a smooth surface that it's ideal for ink blending. When you are ink blending like this or through a stencil, I recommend that you put down a small amount of color and check to see how dark it looks, because it's amazing how much darker the ink blending looks once you remove the tape. So I'm just checking and it looks dark enough to me, so I'm just going to remove the all the tape and start stamping. I'm going to use my Misty stamping tool for all my stamping. For the sentiment, I'm going to use it because I want to make sure that I get a really nice impression and that I don't have to totally redo my panel. And then I need to make sure that I stamp all the balloons exactly in the same place on both the stenciled panel and on the white panel that is going to be behind. Since the sentiment has some letters that are pretty fine and my ink pad was a little bit dry, I did end up stamping the sentiment 3 times. I'm going to start stamping the balloons at the lower end of my panel like I did on the first card. And I will stamp the balloon in each color on both of the panels. So I'm stamping the balloon in navy ink on the front panel, then I'm swapping that panel out for the one that will go behind it and stamping the balloon with the same color. Then I will clean my stamp, move it to the new position, Stamp it with the second ink, which this is actually bamboo from that Altenew set of inks that I used for the first card. And then again, I will swap out the panels and stamp on the front panel with the same bamboo ink. And again, I will clean it off, move it to the new position, stamp it on this panel, and then stamp it on the other panel. Again, I will do the same thing, clean it up, move it to the new position, and this time I'm stamping in sea glass. So anyway, you get the idea. I will repeat the process with the two other inks, which will be Cactus and Tropic Teal. And then what I end up with is two panels that have all the balloons stamped exactly in the same place. The next step is to take the coordinating die and I'm going to die cut each one of the balloons. So you can do this in any order. So just basically align the die with each one of the balloons and die cut them. And when you've done them all, you end up with one large opening in the front panel of the card. To put together the shaker, I'm using a product called Duralar, and I heard about this product from Kristen McGee. She has a website and a YouTube channel, K Becca, and she recommended it for cutting stencils. So I bought with the Silhouette Cameo, and so I bought some of it, and I really like it for shakers and also for embossing. I'm going to do a little bit more testing before I recommend it 100% for embossing rather than the heat resistant acetate, but so far so good. So I'm using that, and then I'm also using this really thin, I guess it's an eighth of an inch. It's definitely skinnier than a quarter of an inch. Tape that I got in a sample pack from scrapbook.com, and I could make just a big rectangle around the balloons, but then my contents would kind of disappear into those other areas. So I feel like I would have to use a lot more shaker bits, so I'm just trying to go close to the balloons. So I'm peeling off the backing, and then I'm just going to place my piece of Duralar right over that. And then to build the wall that will contain the bits, I'm using this 1/4 inch foam tape that I've used earlier. And I totally forgot that it's so much easier to just remove the paper backing from the foam tape and just kind of bend it around. So I ended up cutting all those little pieces, and then I thought, oh yeah, just remove the paper backing and then just bend the foam tape around your shape. So do what I did at the end, not what I did earlier. To fill the shaker, I'm using these clear sequins from the Stamp Market, and I'm just putting some of them onto the balloons, making sure that they're not going to go too far to the edge and end up stuck to my foam tape. Again, I could have put the foam tape around the stamp balloons and it would have made my job a little bit easier, but I didn't think of that at the time, and this works fine too. So I just have to make sure that the sequins are contained and press the top panel into place. You could have made this shaker directly onto an A2 size card base. I could just cut it a little bit wider, but I wanted to add a little bit more navy, so I already have my card base made out of 110 pound Nina ready, and then I also cut a piece of cardstock that is the same dimensions as the card front, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm just gluing that down, and then I'm going to glue the shaker on top of that. And in case you're wondering, the only reason why my card is sitting on a piece of white paper is so that you can see the card better. The last thing I'm doing to the front of the card is gluing a few of the same sequins that I put inside the shaker around the balloons. Actually, I lied. I also drew, once again, the strings of the balloons. This time I used the silver Uniball Signo Broad gel pen. And then I added a couple of the balloons inside of the card, and same thing, drew the strings with the silver gel pen. So here is a quick recap of all the cards. This first one, I love the rainbow and the cheery colors. This one, I love all the metallics, and I like this design. It's a little bit different from just a basic card. This one is just so sparkly of the watercolor. The video really doesn't do it justice. And finally, you have to love a shaker card. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please, please, please leave me a thumbs up. And if you want to do a little shopping, please visit my blog for links to all the products. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.